This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. Covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. My guest is researcher Grace Relf of the Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, or Berkeley Lab. Grace previously spent almost 5 years in policy and research leadership positions with the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission, almost 4 years doing research on utility performance with the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, and over 2 years doing energy and environmental markets research in the private sector. In this episode of the USEA Power Sector Podcast series on new utility planning paradigms, we're going to talk about the impacts on the power sector of variable and customer-owned energy resources, of new demand, and new policy. Grace is going to explain why utilities and regulators are turning to integrated distribution system planning and why they may soon turn to integrated system planning, optimize affordable, reliable electricity delivery. Grace, traditional planning processes are simply no longer adequate for the changing system. Integrated resource planning, or IRP, is increasingly widely accepted, but including distributed energy resources, commonly called DER, into planning is still relatively rare. So before we get into planning approaches that include DER, why is a shift in planning needed? What's the overall goal of planning?
Well, thanks so much for having me. And yes, as you astutely note, the electricity system is changing really rapidly. States are enacting and responding to new policies and new technology trends that are having big impacts on the grid. For example, I think a number of states and other entities like utilities are setting aggressive decarbonization goals. Federal funding has also helped to make clean energy more cost competitive and really has increased the focus on energy equity and justice as well. And I think
Mm.
there's a recognition that the grid needs to be more resilient to increasing extreme weather events. And so these policies and market forces are leading to changes on the grid, like increased clean renewable energy, new loads like electric vehicles and electrified buildings, and customers are increasingly adopting rooftop solar and batteries as well. I'll just give one example. I live here in Hawaii, and Hawaii's grids have very high penetration of variable renewable energy. Hawaii regularly operates at 100% renewable energy, and our other islands, about 15 or 20% of the energy on these islands comes directly from rooftop customer sited solar. So
Wow.
these trends really require new ways of managing and coordinating and balancing the grid. And so grid planners are having to respond and take new approaches to planning for this system that's much more sophisticated and complicated than what they were seeing in the past.
Mm.
Traditionally, grid planning has occurred in siloed processes, and they didn't really interact or influence one another. So that may have been looking at the transmission system independently of the distribution system, and then looking at generation independently of that as well. Integrated planning techniques really aim to look at the grid holistically and use a systematic approach to identify what the grid needs and then what the solutions are that are going to best meet the objectives of that planning process. So usually those would be customer service expectations, reliability, and other state and utility objectives that may be outlined for utilities.
So, um, utilities and other system operators are turning to this new idea, relatively new idea, called integrated distribution system planning, IDSP. Have they seen concrete results with IDSP in bringing customer-owned DER into the planning process and in using those resources to create more reliable, affordable electricity?
Yeah. Integrated distribution system planning, or IDSP, as you mentioned, it is a decision-making framework. So it helps
Mhm.
utilities determine what long-term distribution grid investment strategies they need to implement to help address state and local policy goals, other objectives, maintain reliability, and really kind of address that evolution at the grid edge you're mentioning, integration of DERs and customer-sited resources. IDSP usually looks at, like I mentioned, grid reliability. It would also look at resilience, safety, operational efficiency, and then how to use those DERs. So it really is a holistic view of what the distribution system needs going forward.
Mm.
I'll just like
Okay.
as one example, the Minnesota PUC requires integrated distribution system plans that actually integrate grid modernization and transportation electrification plans too, because those really impact distribution system needs. And to your questions about whether utilities have seen concrete results, I would say definitely yes.
Ah,
Multiple jurisdictions have IDSP goals or objectives that are related to supporting DER integration and utilization. And multiple states, many states, require consideration of DERs in the load forecasting step of integrated distribution system planning. As one example, the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities identified facilitating DER interconnection and integration of DERs into the utilities planning and operations as one of the high-level objectives for their grid modernization and distribution system planning initiatives. And
huh.
in Hawaii, where rooftop solar is so prevalent, Hawaiian Electric is using an integrated planning process to help determine the value of DERs to its system. So this helps the utility understand how they can best deploy DERs to meet grid needs and what technologies it needs to invest in to enable those functions. And this has helped, across multiple proceedings in terms of helping to understand how much to compensate customers for what their DERs are providing back to the grid, and really helping the utility to understand when to deploy those resources and help reduce grid constraints.
This is really interesting. So you mentioned three states, very different states: Minnesota, Massachusetts, Hawaii. Now, Minnesota, I believe I got this right. Minnesota and Massachusetts are very much looking at how to incorporate distributed energy resources into planning. Hawaii has a different approach, a more advanced approach, it seems to me. And please clarify this for me if I'm not understanding it clearly. They are using something called integrated system planning, or ISP, which seems to be something of a step forward from IDSP, the kinds of planning processes that you mentioned for Minnesota and Massachusetts. Why is it a utility like Hawaiian Electric turn to ISP? I think they call it integrated grid planning, to improve reliability and affordability.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as usual in the energy sector, we tend to have a bunch of acronyms.
Yeah.
um, but the type of planning approach that a utility will take really depends on kind of the landscape and the markets in which they operate in. Integrated system planning looks at all of the elements of the grid together. So that would be generation, transmission, distribution, load, DERs, those kinds of elements. So really holistic. And it aims to harmonize some of those traditionally siloed planning processes by aligning the inputs and methods and information flows across those different levels of planning. It's similar to integrated distribution system planning, but
Ah,
yeah, it goes beyond just that distribution system level and looks at, generation, transmission, and other levels of the grid as well.
mm.
In some cases too, integrated system planning may look at gas and electric systems together, where a utility might operate both systems in the same location. And as I mentioned, the utility's approach to planning will vary based on its structure and state requirements. So in some cases where utilities don't own generation or where they don't serve gas customers, integrated system planning might not make as much sense for them because other entities may be conducting a different type of related planning. And in those cases, it's really important to make sure that the planning process that the utility does conduct, distribution system planning, for example, is well coordinated with the other planning processes. And that can really help to achieve some of the same outcomes and benefits of an integrated system planning process or
Hmm.
ISP. And
Hmm.
I would mention, I think that there are a lot of benefits to doing integrated system planning. You asked whether this is kind of a next step forward. And I would say, yes, there are many benefits to coordinating or integrating planning processes. It is complex, but using consistent inputs across planning processes can really help to increase the understanding of those plans, the transparency of the results, and really ultimately the credibility of the planning results as well. And it helps to ensure that utilities are considering all of the possible solutions to the grid needs that they identify, and really to compare solutions on an apples to apples basis so that they can identify what would best meet their objectives. And in many cases, this can result in cost savings to customers. So I think, in my view, yes, I think integrated system planning or coordination of planning processes really can help move things forward and improve outcomes.
One question that I want to end up with, Grace, is all of these new ideas include the word integrated and the word planning. And that seems to be what the most important feature is, that we're integrating what the utility has available to it, whether it's in Minnesota or Massachusetts or Hawaii, into its planning. Now, I know you're working with regulators in Washington State, which is again another different kind of state, and you're working to develop this integrated system planning with Puget Sound Energy, a big investor-owned utility. And this new approach to planning introduces complexities that regulators and policymakers and utilities haven't really seen before. And I'd just like to briefly, in the time we have left, get your impression of how folks are reacting to the dealing with these complexities. Does it seem like they are understanding that ISP is the future of utility planning? Is it the future?
In my experience, regulators are increasingly recognizing the need to move to this integrated planning approach because, as we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, because of the really expanding goals and policies and requirements that the grid is facing. And so I think that regulators are definitely moving in this direction. And I will say, though, that as you mentioned, it's sort of in early stages, integrated system planning, and it's not
Mm.
without its challenges. First off, integrated system planning is new to most utilities and regulators. Even in leading states like Hawaii, the utility and the regulator are iterating on the utility's first attempt at an integrated grid plan and identifying ways that they can do it better in the next round. And ISP integrated system planning also requires a lot of time and staff resources from utilities and regulators and stakeholders who are involved. And the modeling techniques and software are very complex. It can be costly. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily feasible for every utility to start at the most complex integrated system planning approaches. But I think that's where places like Berkeley Lab are playing an important role because we help to provide education and support for utilities and regulators and stakeholders to understand common practices and best practices at all stages of that integrated system planning process, whether you're just starting out or trying to do more complex integrated modeling.
Interesting.
I really do think that ISP, or at the very least, coordination of planning processes, is gonna continue to grow over time. It's just really what is needed to meet the evolving challenges of this moment.
Right. And I love that what you just said. It's needed to meet the evolving challenges, which means that temporary setbacks like supply chain issues or political differences, it, they may slow the process, but the process seems like it has to go on. But that's all the time we have. I just want to mention in passing that I always say, or often say on the podcast, we're in an energy transition. It's going to go on. It's not an energy left turn, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I think a good planning process would be designed to evolve over time and be flexible enough to meet those evolutions over time.
Great. Yes, I agree completely. That's it for this podcast. I've got to thank my guest, Berkeley Lab researcher Grace Relf. She's described integrated system planning, the newest step forward in supporting utility efforts, ongoing efforts to manage the impacts of variable and customer owned energy resources, new demand, and new emerging policies in the power sector. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.